So today we're going to be walking through Oracle Business Intelligence Enterprise Edition, OBIEE. And I have more slides here that I'm going to be going through. There's a few slides at the end based upon some questions that were asked prior to that I want to get to. And a few other ones I'm just leaving in so that those of you who would like to pull down the copy of the presentation later will have. So as far as the agenda, we're going to be first looking at Weblogic for reasons that will be explored in a pretty good amount of detail. We're going to be moving on then to OBIEE itself, and then looking through this presentation. I really took, looking at this presentation, I was looking through it through the lens of somebody wanting to maybe perform a security audit or think about functionality that could be or should be included in securing an OBIEE implementation. With that said, I've included a number of talking points or questions. And last, we're going to be touching on Oracle eBusiness Suite integration, specifically some questions that were asked with regard to authentication with the Oracle eBusiness Suite. Just to help put into context who we are, in case you are not familiar with Integrigy, we have two lines of business. We have our services business that concentrates on security and risk assessments, helping customers think through compliance issues as well as design and helping to meet compliance. We also have a product line, App Sentry and App Defend, which are security scanning and as well as application firewall solutions for the Oracle eBusiness Suite. So this is an educational webinar, so just wanted to leave this one slide in as far as to help with introductions. So getting into it, the first slide here, and we'll be returning to this slide a few times, is to help with the transition between the topics here. But when I look at OBIEE, I'm looking at a Weblogic application, a Fusion middleware application, and the size of the boxes here are proportionate to, at least in my opinion, the importance to security, such that we have Weblogic itself, we have the external authentication through the LDAP, we have the repository supporting the Fusion middleware product, we have Enterprise Manager. Within OBIEE, again, from a security perspective, what we're trying to do with you here today is to walk through what needs to be considered or thought through as far as security for OBIEE. So I'm not going to be going into detail as to how to create dashboards, how to create reports. That said, the BI administration tool is where much of what security is defined in, and we will be spending time there to review that. On the right side, we have the web catalog, and at the bottom, we have the data sources itself. So at a high level, what we're doing when we're sitting down to author or consider security within OBIEE, we're sitting first with the Windows-based BI administration tool. When we're then ready, we're deploying that, and we're deploying that by uploading the RPD file to Enterprise Manager. So we'll be coming back to this this picture at least a few times in the presentation, and we'll first look at Weblogic. So OBIEE as a Fusion middleware product runs inside of Weblogic. So this is where the authentication is occurring. And I should take a moment and just say the assumption for this presentation is OBIEE 11G. There were a few questions asked prior with regard to the security changes between 10G and 11G. I do have a slide towards the back of the deck to summarize that, some of the points, but I will be verbally kind of addressing that a few slides here as we go. So with 11G, authentication and key authorization steps are occurring inside of Weblogic. This is where the web services are being run. These are where the key critical Java web services are also being run. So to secure OBIEE, you need to secure Weblogic first and foremost. So with that, patch levels. So Weblogic's versions 10.3.5 and 10.3.6 are specific If you are running on an earlier version of OBIEE, maybe 11.116, it's very likely or very possible that you are on an obsolete, running an obsolete version of Weblogic. So point here would be, as with any good security program, to maintain current patch levels. And with that, 10.3.6 is something to keep in mind. Certainly the grace period of December 2021 is far enough out there. And that will be the terminal patch for 11G. So the file system itself, when looking at Weblogic, what Weblogic is, how it works, and more importantly, how it's secured, is really defined within the file system itself. Who has access to the configuration files, the XML files that are spread across the subdirectories there listed on the right, that is what defines Weblogic. So it's very important to, when assessing the security, to be very clear as to who has access in, and more importantly, when you are running Weblogic, you want to make sure that you're not running Weblogic as a privileged user. So there's some, in the accompanying white paper we have with this presentation, we do have some specific hints and best practices with regard to how to protect the file system and also to how to run Weblogic. If your OBIEE application is public-facing, or I should say if the Weblogic that is hosting your OBIEE is public-facing, some specific things that you will need to think about. First and foremost, are you using a web application firewall? Are you current? Specifically, are you running 10.3.6 or above? Are you running Java 1.7 would be our recommendation. And something that we see commonly in our security assessments are the configurations. So as you think about best practices for securing any website, the powered by robots.txt services that are exposed, don't forget. Just lighting up OBIEE and you're only internally facing, you should still think through these, but certainly if you're public facing, don't forget about these. You do need to do some post-configuration steps, post-install steps to make sure that you're hardening and the server and also then hardening Weblogic itself. So as a Fusion middleware application, Weblogic is supported by a relational database. Oracle is recommended, but not required. For the repository creation utility is used to create this repository specifically for OBIEE. The schemas are the BI platform and the MDS. You need to think about the security, again, from top to bottom, of how you're securing this database, following all best practices, specifically, to the vendor. The ability to access the metadata here, there should be little to no reason for anybody to access the schemas. Certainly, you want to follow best practices for securing those databases. Moving on into some specific pieces of vocabulary with regard to Weblogic. Security realms are the container in which the security configurations are placed. This is where the definitions of the security roles and policies, specifically when thinking through a security solution for Weblogic, this is where the users and the groups are defined, and the key decision point for OBIEE is really to take the default realm that comes out of the box or to customize your own. How you answer that question is dependent on how well you are using Weblogic. So as a Fusion middleware app, these are the centralized common services that would transcend all of the Fusion middleware apps being supported by that Weblogic installation. So this is a significant change from 10G as far as the security that is in or defined in Weblogic. We'll get into this a little bit more, but where users are defined and a good part of the authorization logic has now been pulled up out of, we'll say, the repository into Weblogic. So foreshadowing that, the key vocabulary word here, if you're not familiar with it, is the Oracle Platform Security Services, OPSS. So these security services transcend all the Fusion Middleware products, whether or not it's supporting OBIEE or SOA, or you could even, if you're running Oracle eBusiness Suite 12.2, OPPS is where the key identity store, policy store, and credential store are being defined. The box on the right there, the external LDAP, Oracle Weblogic Server comes out of the box with a LDAP, built-in LDAP solution. There's some guidance that Oracle is giving with regard to using this or not using this for production. Our white paper speaks to that in some detail. But the idea here is that Weblogic is taking care of the authentication. So with regard to Weblogic, Weblogic scripting tools, or WLST, as DBAs use SQL to administer and support a database, Weblogic administrators use Weblogic scripting tools. This is very powerful. Anything that you can do in the GUI user interface, you can also do via the scripts. So you need to think about, from a security perspective, who can physically log on and has credentials to use Weblogic scripting. What are the security permissions within OPSS and the whole security framework that if they were so allowed to in the GUI, that they could also the same do in the Weblogic scripting. You want to think about hard coding of credentials. If, for example, I write the script, if I hard coding my credentials on that, you don't want to then have me pass off and have somebody else run the script on my behalf. Very important to be thinking through how best to secure Weblogic scripting tools. Auditing. So as we have multiple layers of complexity with OBIEE 11G here, if we're thinking through a holistic audit, logging and audit strategy and approach, you're going to want to think about, and we'll talk about OBIEE logging and auditing later, that at the Weblogic layer, there are some common log and audit functionality that you're going to want to configure. And you can also want to think about how you're streaming this to your Splunk or your ArcSight or your common repositories. So large change from 10G to 11G here is that with 11G, OBIEE is consuming application roles. So these application roles are, think of this as the metadata that transcends all of the applications that are using the Fusion middleware. So we have the LDAP, whether or not it's external, internal, we have the LDAP groups being mapped to application roles, and then the child or subscribing applications such as OBIEE are consuming those roles and then applying appropriate permissions and grants within. So another way of looking at that, if I have out of the box with OBIEE, I have BI consumers, BI authors, BI administrators, so people that can run reports, people that can create reports, people that can do anything. So I'm going to be mapping, defining these roles inside of Enterprise Manager. I'm going to be mapping those roles to LDAP groups, and then I'm going to be applying permissions within OBIEE itself to these. So I'm not doing this in the repository anymore. You're doing this with application roles. Key decision here for you when you're thinking through, or if you're looking at it from an audit perspective, have custom roles been defined, and what do they have access to do? So moving on now, we've spoke through at a high level. Again, there's a lot more to Weblogic than what I touched on there, and the white paper does touch on a few more levels of detail. But we're now going to move on to OBIEE, and we're going to start this security discussion with the review of the security as defined in the BI administration tool. So just to help with where we're at, if we use the flow here of a user attempting to log on, being authenticated, being specifically authenticated in Weblogic, now we are here, we can see we need to be listing for the end user what it is specifically they have access via what reports or dashboards they have access to, and then when they exercise and run those reports, what row level filtering could be occurring. So just to start peeling back the levels here, the repository file here within OBIEE is where you define the solution. So on the right we have the sources, be it the data warehouse or the ERP platform. At the physical layer, that's where you're defining the tables and columns in the source for the data sources, as well as the user, the account, and the password to connect. At the business model mapping layer, the BMM layer, that is where you are building logical tables that could point to one or more physical tables. The presentation layer is built of components of subject areas, and those could also be built of one or more logical tables. The idea here is, though, that the repository file itself defines everything. So the screenshot on the right is of the BI administration tool showing the physical tables, the logical tables, and the subject areas. Security is included. Everything to do with an OBIEE implementation is contained with or defined pretty much within the repository file. When thinking about security, the repository file itself requires a password to open. So who has access to the password is important. The production versus non-production password best practices would dictate that it would be prudent to have different RPD passwords for prod versus non-prod. And also when you're deploying it, who has access to deploy, in that you have to type the RPD password in Enterprise Manager to deploy it. The RPD file is also encrypted. The password is actually used to encrypt it, so a complex password would be prudent to use to make sure that robust encryption, you fully taken advantage of all the encryption. We will come back to this topic, but it is also possible to save the repository file as a set of XML files. So if you do that, let's say on your laptop, all of the attributes, certainly the security attributes, would then be exposed and no longer encrypted. Taking a deeper look here, what we're talking about here with the OBIEE, we have a logon, we have, we'll say behind the scenes here, initialization blocks firing. These are blocks of SQL code that are specifically setting variables to drive filters. So on the left, what we have, if we kind of build up from the bottom, we have our physical data sources that are defined in as the physical tables inside the RPD file, logical tables, presentation layers, and we have in the following slides here, we're going to be walking through how these filters are created. The key point here I want to draw your attention to is that at the presentation layer is where we are going to be, or where you can create permissions, and then outside the RPD file in the web catalog itself, this is where the access control lists are defined. So when the user logs on, transparently to them, initializations blocks fire, variables are set. They, though, just see what reports they have access to, and all that is determined by the access control list as defined within the catalog. So there's 3 levels of security that we are talking about within the RPD: data level, object level, and then the presentation. So we're talking about filters to on rows within result sets. We have permissions, and then we have set in the catalog application roles as mapped to specific subject areas. We'll get into this a little bit more detail. But for the data level security, here's where you're going to be thinking about applying the row or column level, if those are your requirements, primarily based upon filters. There are 2 different types of variables. We have, we'll say, global repository variables as well as session. And as you go thinking about how to define different security filters, how and when you define different variables comes into play. So the initialization block. The initialization block is really key. This is where the variables are set. So if I have, for example, a variable called like eBusiness Suite Responsibility ID, I'm going to populate that through an initialization block. Inside the initialization block, I have some SQL statements. Data level security, here's where I will, let's say in the prior slide, if I define the variable, here's how we'd use it. I'm going to set up a filter, and I did some screenshots here, but I think you get the flow here as far as I'm going to right mouse click on a object, and then I'm going to think about the appropriate data filters. When you are defining variables and thinking about filters, you need to also keep in mind how the OBIEE cache works. Again, we're not going to go into a lot of the mechanics of how OBIEE works, or even how best to think about performance tuning. But if you are using, especially if you're using a virtual private database, you need to think about some specific attributes when you're defining the actual connection. The screenshot on the right there, you want to make sure that you're checking the virtual private database checkbox there for the connection, as well as any variables that you define. You want to check the security sensitive, and that's going to support how that's going to derive what is, we'll say, recycled or shared within the cache versus what is going to be reset. Object level security here, I think the best way to describe that is with a screenshot here. If I am in the presentation layer there and I have my child subject areas, I'm going to right mouse click on one of those subject areas, and up comes the ability to set permissions. And the permissions that I'm giving read access or read write or no access to is defined by those application roles that are defined in Enterprise Manager, and what I'm mapping to as far as LDAP roles. Big change from 10G. So now we're going to be moving to the OBIEE web catalog here. Specifically in the catalog, this is where the access control lists itemize what it is exactly that a user can do and see. Key point is that the catalog only has visibility into the subject areas within the presentation layer. So as I'm building up physical tables and columns and defining those, as I'm then defining logical tables, and then I'm pulling those logical tables into subject areas, the subject areas could be broken across, let's say, topics or areas such as HR versus finance versus project accounting. It could also be broken into subsets. But the idea, specifically, when you start thinking about the layers of security and where to best define them, you want to think about, at least where I start thinking about it is from the bottom up. So the presentation catalog is structured through a series of ATR files. If you have access to the Weblogic file system, you can actually go and read those. You actually need a hex editor, but each report, each object, each dashboard, folder has a subsequent ATR file that lists out who can see and do what with that object. The screenshot on the right is of the client server Windows Catalog client. There's also a web version of this, but here is where you would go in and set the or define the access control list. So from a security perspective, the presentation catalog reports are vital to be able to run these for sets of ACLs or objects. Specifically, what I have in the screenshot there is the security access control list. When we do a security audit, that is one of the first things that we ask for, in that this is going to lay out who has key administration privileges. The other key point here is that you want to use the very easy to use export to Excel for analysis and reporting. Screenshot here of the web version of the presentation catalog, and the just another note about the security ACL, and the line pointing to it's kind of an eye test there, but who can issue SQL directly. We'll come back to that point, but this is if you are seeing this and you want to get a report, you ask for the presentation catalog report, and you can run that through the client tool. The client tool, this tool that I was referring to, this is installed with the BI administration tool. So when you run the client install, it actually will install both. So at a high level, we've spoken to a few of these points already. The changes with 11G. We have users and groups are no longer defined in the RPD. All this is now being defined within Weblogic. Security policies are no longer mapped to groups. They're being mapped to application roles. These roles transcend all of Fusion applications. And the administration user, this was in 10G and prior, this was a key user created on install that had specific privileges for internal services as well as maintenance. This user no longer has any specific privileges. It is, we'll say, just another user, and any other number of users could have the same admin privileges. So with regard to a quick overview of Weblogic and some of the primary components of OBIEE security, what I want to do here would be to kind of, time permitting here, touch on a few of these topics as far as security, and either if you're an auditor or an IT security manager, you know, we want to be asking a few of these questions. Key accounts, there are certainly some specific OS accounts that are own the Weblogic file system as well as the user. You want to make very sure that you're not running Weblogic as a privileged user. Next on the list here, I would say you want to be very clear as to who has access to the Weblogic administration rights. Sometimes when we run an audit, we'll find a couple dozen people that have full admin rights to everything in Weblogic. Some of these turn up sometimes to be developers that maybe at some point in time they were deploying or testing something, but certainly in a production environment should have no access into Weblogic production. A few key points about the, we'll say that some of the mechanics and specific pieces of functionality within OBIEE itself. OBIEE itself has the ability to write back. This would mean that if I'm inside of OBIEE, I'm going to be, if I have the, I can have the ability to update records in the data source. Why would I want to do that? I might have some specific functionality, let's say for budgeting, that I want to do some what-if analysis that might make sense. But as far as a security audit, you want to make sure that you know who, as far as in the presentation catalog report, when you run the security ACL, who can issue direct SQL, and then you want to take that to hopefully the second layer, if you down at the physical, when you start defining the physical tables, as to what connections have been set up to support write-backs. Security migrations and configurations. We went through, hopefully you have some appreciation for the complexity of Weblogic, application roles, all of the setups for the integration in with either, especially if you have an external LDAP solution that you're using. When you start thinking about test and development and production environments and how you're migrating changes amongst, there's some very specific do's and don'ts as far as whether or not you're using the GUI or Weblogic scripting to move these security realm, or we should say the OPSS policies and securities, policies and credentials amongst. Source code control. The RPD in that it is so much the center or single source of truth for anything about an OBIEE, we'll say application layer. Do you have that under source code control? We are commonly recommending to consider using the feature to export to Excel and then place individual parts of the RPD file under source code control. At the presentation layer within the RPD, you can click on any subject area and get a permissions report. So the screenshot you have there, there's a right mouse click. You can click on the Save As and you can export to Excel. And the key here is that these permission reports are walking through who has access to the subject areas. What is not going to be included in the permission reports or anything as far as object level filters defined at the BMM or physical layer. Usage tracking. OBIEE has a very robust set of functionality to track who did what as far as not just making changes to the RPD itself, but also who ran what report when. To set this up, Oracle provides a sample RPD file. You have to manually copy components into your RPD. The recommendation that we also are making is that you redirect as much as possible the usage tracking out to a centralized logging solution. So again, made some comments prior as far as the ability to set up logging and auditing within Weblogic itself. You also want to set up the logging and usage tracking within the OBIEE, and as much as possible think through the opportunities to pursue a holistic log and audit solution, and if you have tools such as Splunk and ArcSight, to have them pick up the log and audit activity. So I've given the specific clause parameter within the NQS config ini, which is the primary configuration file for OBIEE, as to what to set if you are wanting to do that. So before a few slides, I mentioned the ability to issue direct SQL access. So in a security audit, one thing that you want to be concerned with, again, is who can issue direct SQL. So the screenshot that I have on the left there is kind of a, we'll say fictitious there, but it's basically giving somebody $1 million salary. And they're doing so by using the issue direct SQL right through the OBIEE the interface there. The potentially, for me at least, is of more concern in any security audit is the Go URL. Now this is a URL that has been around a long time. The Go URL itself is a set of services that, in part define a lot about what OBIEE is as far as the core services. If you are using third-party sites and you are just constructing URLs to run reports, you can have you can run a full report, see the results, and actually print it all through the URL. You don't even need the OBIEE user interface. Who can issue direct SQL? Very important. And also you want to be very concerned as to how you have secured the Go URL. The example that I have right here is literally cut, copy, paste that to your browser, and then you would see in the browser the results. One point is that only those objects in the RPD can be queried. So those of you that have OBIEE set up to pull directly against, let's say, PeopleSoft or the Oracle eBusiness Suite, you want to be very clear as to what objects have been defined and what security, because potentially you could use the Go URL to to bypass a lot of levels of security and pull information in that you shouldn't necessarily have access to. OBIEE has act as versus impersonation here. I just want to include the slide as far as some of the differences here. I'm just going to move on because I do want to point out with regard to the log levels, logging and log levels. We mentioned the user tracking. OBIEE has the ability to set log levels between 0 and 7, and it gets increasingly, more information is trapped. The higher the log you get, the higher the number. Key point is that it's not possible to set roles, set the logging for a role. You have to set it at the user level. On the left, I have included some of the key log files that you will want to potentially include as far as any review, or potentially include in any passing of or parsing into Splunk or ArcSight solutions. Another feature that you might not be aware of is you can set up this when you are defining a filter for an object. You can also define a time restriction such that in this case this user could only use or throw a query against specific tables on Wednesday between 6 a.m. and noon. Just something to keep in mind if you're thinking about the capabilities of OBIEE itself. Virtual private databases, Data Vault, row-level security. Some pros and cons. Some of the questions we got was surrounding this. If you are debating as to whether or not VPD or Data Vault, you want to think about the rules. And certainly if the data source is only supporting an OBIEE implementation, maybe the OBIEE data filters would be sufficient. But if the data source is supporting more than one application, the VPD then might alternatively be better. As I said, we had some questions with regard to Oracle eBusiness Suite, authentication and authorization. So I tried to put this slide together here as far as how the process works. So what we're talking about here in this slide is Oracle eBusiness Suite authentication. That is, a user is logging into the Oracle eBusiness Suite. They're clicking on a function in a menu, which then brings them into OBIEE. What is happening behind the scenes is that the Oracle Oasis JSP is generating a URL based upon the profile or the profile option FND Oracle Business Intelligence EE-based URL. This can be set up in a lab in a matter of only minutes. There are a few XML files that need to be edited within the OBIEE file system. The white paper that we have accompanying with this webinar goes into the steps in a little bit more detail. But really what's happening is that we're passing the Oracle EBS session cookie to OBIEE. The initialization block is then firing, and it's pulling in the Oracle EBS user's identity, that identity being defined by the, should be familiar, responsibility ID, user ID, employee ID, such that the authentication or the authorization roles can then be built. So if this is authentication, how does authorization work with the Oracle eBusiness Suite? That's where it doesn't get so straightforward. You would need to go in and physically define in Enterprise Manager application roles that usually what I've seen have mapped to, on a one-on-one basis, same spellings or misspellings as Oracle responsibility names. And then you are going through either the presentation layer security or the catalog security appropriately. So before we get to some questions here, I just wanted to kind of go through a summary slide here. So what we talked about first was Weblogic. The user logs into Weblogic. They're authenticated either externally or internally with LDAP. The first layer of authorization is then occurring in the Oracle Platform Security Services. For example, do they have access to OBIEE? What then is happening is that the application roles, that identity that was authenticated, is passed to OBIEE. So transparent to the end user, then what is happening is that the initialization blocks are firing, filters are set, but what the user sees then first is the catalog of what dashboards and reports that they have. When what the user sees in the catalog is defined by those access control lists in the catalog, those ATR files within the file system, once they click on and exercise an artifact, be it a report or a dashboard, the logic is defined in the RPD file, then fires. And so the layers of security there are the permissions within the presentation layer there. Those are mapping out to the application roles. And then at a lower level, the filters, the data filters that have been set up at the VMM and physical layer. So that's a quick tour of OBIEE security. We will be going through parts of this presentation again at Collaborate. If you are going to Collaborate, we very much would enjoy the opportunity to talk with you more about any questions you might have about OBIEE security or any Oracle security questions you might have. And we have some other sessions that we're offering here. And with that, Phil, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Mike. Yes, we do. We have a couple here. The first one, what are the major differences and improvements in 11G over 10G in terms of security?
Okay. Well, I've touched on that in a few different slides here, but certainly I would answer that as far as Weblogic and what is being done in Weblogic as far as the definition of the user is coming in most likely through an external LDAP solution. Authentication then occurring there in Weblogic through that LDAP solution, and then that first layer of authorization to the application roles. Again, those application roles now are replacing from 10G. You would have done that prior in the RPD file defining groups. Now that is being done inside of Enterprise Manager.
Okay, next one. How can we avoid using the app's password on the OBIEE side and connecting to EBS?
Probably not the best idea. If I'll kind of go back up to the slide itself here, what's happening with the authentication is that in the initialization block, you can see here that the app session validate needs to be called. That PL SQL package is owned by apps. If you are not using, or actually our recommendation would be to build a custom custom user with the requisite grants to be able to call that successfully. But certainly what you don't want to do is expose the app's username and password and have that stored in the RPD file, would at least be my recommendation.
All right, next question. What is a good comparison for row and column level security with application row-based security?
Well, if I have, trying to understand the context of the question there. So if I have users that could only see certain employees in a certain division but not in another division, that to me would be something I would attempt at a row level if I could through a session variable, especially if I can pick that off, let's say through a variable that would be defined for the org ID or department ID. For the presentation catalog, if I don't want to go through and define filters individually, for specific objects over and over again the same, to me that's where the presentation layer gives me the ability to set at a macro level a set of subject areas, and so I could have a subject area for one division versus the other division.